Written on the pages of the great book of nature lies a truth so profound that it has beckoned men and women throughout the ages to seek its wisdom. We will continue this quest and study many stories of humanity as we search for this light. On this journey, we will examine philosophy, religion, and science to uncover the hidden mysteries behind myth and legend using the symbols of universal Freemasonry. Welcome to Legends of the Craft.
Welcome back to Legends of the Craft. I'm here with Brother Axel Savari. We have a great episode, which is Postmodernism and Freemasonry. This is a subject that we've been discussing probably now for a greater part of a year, and we've decided to do a podcast on it because we believe that it has had a fundamental impact on Freemasonry. Postmodernism is a philosophy which kind of arose out of the 19th century, but really, took hold in the middle of the 20th century after World War II, and consequently, if you look at the membership numbers in Freemasonry, you'll see that beginning after World War II is when you start to see a decline all the way to this very day. Now, we can't prove causation or correlation here, but it is interesting to note that as the membership has declined, the postmodern ideas have been on a rise. Now, many of you may not know what this word is. Maybe you've heard of it, but I guarantee as we go through this podcast that you will identify many of your own views. You'll identify TV shows, essentially all popular culture, with postmodernism. It's the underlying philosophy of the world today, whether you're conscious of it or you're unconscious of it. And postmodernism, I'm not going to say it's an evil thing or it's a good thing. It's a reaction to the 19th century. It's a reaction to the Enlightenment. It's a reaction to two world wars. It's the natural evolution, I believe, to the events that have taken place in the past. And we need to learn to analyze this philosophy, its origin, and we need to learn how to overcome its deficiencies and to move us forward. So that's kind of what we'll be discussing today.
Yeah, postmodernism as a philosophy has certainly become a very, what would you say, a timely talking point. I think a lot of people, especially probably people in our audience, but a lot of people in society in general have heard the word postmodernism either decried by somebody or, lambasted as the death of all Western civilization or something like that. And it tends to be discussed in a way that isn't really fair to its tenets and doesn't really get to the subtleties of its errors. I think people are often like, "Oh, postmodernism is destroying everything," and well, you may have a case in some regard. The subtlety of the argument itself is lost on people, and I think that needs to be corrected because it's quite fascinating what it's done to popular culture.
Yeah, this is not going to be some sort of right-wing, podcast here. We're not Ben Shapiro, Jordan Peterson, and we're not here to, explain to you why Western civilization is in collapse. Postmodernism, like I said earlier, it's the natural evolution of mankind, and you kind of have to see it as the equivalence of adolescence. You get these teenage kids, and they naturally rebel against their parents and think that everything's stupid and everything is inferior and they're the smartest person in the world. And I kind of equate postmodernism with that stage in the evolution of a person. It's when you start to kind of look at everything a little more critically, and you start to wonder why you believed what you did, and you start to realize that maybe you've been indoctrinated a little bit, and then you start kind of ripping everything apart. And it's a natural stage and it has to happen, but there also has to be something that comes afterward.
Well, it's interesting that, when adolescent teenagers start rebelling against authority and questioning those beliefs, they often resort to the idea first of God is dead, that Nietzschean, proclamation that God has died and that he was only the opiate of the masses the entire time anyway, so good riddance to him. But it's funny. I think you and I would both agree that idea, that statement of Nietzsche, is kind of at the foundation of what would eventually become postmodernism. That signaled a shift ideologically amongst Western academics that kind of goes in the direction of postmodernism.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, Nietzsche is going to be the beginning of our history of postmodernism here. But to kind of define postmodernism more, you have to know what modernism is, because it's postmodernism, right? So what is modernism? Well, modernism was a movement from about 1900 to about 1930. And modernism was this idea of like, oh, look, we have all this great technology, we've defeated disease. We have sanitation now. We're making life easier. People are surviving now because of the technological, glories that man has discovered. And so this age of modernism was a rebellion against the church, against Christianity in the Western world. It was a hope that technology could solve all our problems. But there was also this idea that God was dead, as you brought up, Brother Axel, that man had empowered himself to the point that we could create utopian societies. We could solve all our problems. We didn't need an external source.
Well, exactly. If God had died, then so be it. Like, we're on our own, and that's just fine because we can do whatever we want, and there's no limit to our progress that we can make on our own.
And that's where Nietzsche kind of comes into this equation, because his quote, God is dead, I think has really been misunderstood by just about everybody, because, right-wing Christians kind of use it as a phrase to say that, oh, look at these atheists, they think they've killed God and all that. And what Nietzsche is really saying, and Brother Axel's going to read the quote here in a moment of what he wrote in his writings. What he's basically trying to say is that mankind has killed God. The Enlightenment killed God. Rationality killed God. This sort of objective point in the universe that everybody could rally behind and explained everything. And he was actually making this statement out of fear. He's like, well, now that we've killed God as a society, as a civilization, what's going to replace God? What are we going to do without God? Will rationality succeed in replacing him? Will we find a way of finding a moral system that everybody could follow? What are we going to do without God? And he was actually genuinely very concerned for the future of humanity.
Well, and he was absolutely justified in his fears. Because I think that's he writes that at the end of the 1880s, and then shortly after that, the 20th century is unleashed.
And what we find in the 20th century is 2 world wars that killed literally hundreds of millions of people, including, Stalin, including Maoist China. I mean, these horrible regimes that were atheistic regimes that had denounced religion, said God did not exist. And what they do, they literally killed millions and millions of people in an attempt to create utopian societies.
Well, World War I, too, was an experiment in doing away with the ancient monarchies of Europe. Monarchies that had stood, for better or for worse, had stood for centuries and centuries as points of fixation, ideologically, philosophically, spiritually, for all the people that lived in those kingdoms. That was the order of the day, and all of that was wiped away in 4 years, and millions of people were slaughtered. It was, and it psychologically traumatized Europe for a century. And it, in my opinion, and I think in Nietzsche's, I think that comes from the logical conclusion of the Enlightenment, so to say, the absolute extinction of God in everyone's life. Because without God, you can't have a king, because the king is the king because he's God's representative on earth. So if you kill God, then the king has to go down by default.
So, Brother Axel, why don't you read this quote from The Gay Science, which is Nietzsche's 1882 work that specified this exact quote that we're talking about.
Quote, God is dead. God remains dead, and we have killed him. How shall we comfort ourselves, the murderers of all murderers? What was holiest and mightiest of all that the world has yet owned has bled to death under our knives. Who will wipe this blood off us? What water is there for us to clean ourselves? What festivals of atonement, what sacred games shall we have to invent? Is not the greatness of this deed too great for us? Must we ourselves not become gods simply to appear worthy of it?
This is just so fascinating, because you can see the fear. It's like, what are we going to do? What are we going to have to invent? Was this deed even too great for us, he says. And it's so true. And I think even here in the 21st century, a long time after this quote was written, have we found the replacement of God? I mean, I see our society as one in distress. I see our society as one that's completely split on what is true, and people literally are trying to find their own identities because there's nothing objective to hold on to anymore. Mm-hmm. Everything is confusion. Everything has been reduced so much to the level of the individual and their perspective, and that whatever they think is true, it's become very egocentric, our society, that I think it relates back to God is dead. There's no objective truth. There's no objective morality. There's no objective sort of values and etiquette in society. So what do? Well, everybody can do whatever they want. Mm-hmm. But has that made us happier? Have we conquered religion?
Well, it's a destructive philosophy in the sense of, or at least beginning of a philosophy, because we acknowledge that with children you don't do this. You don't give children no rules and access to everything and accept them to come out of the other end of their childhood safely. I mean, we acknowledge that that's a dangerous thing to do, that we have boundaries and rules for people for a reason, because there are dangers in the world. Well, there's a danger to going through the world without any reason. And when I say reason, I don't mean enlightenist rationalism. I mean a reason for being, or a purpose to your life. That's, to be without that is a very dangerous place to be, frankly. And I think Nietzsche was vindicated with the 20th century. It absolutely fell to pieces. And it was really only kind of the restoration of a moment of peace towards the end of the century, with the collapse of the Soviet Union, that we were even able to take a breath and think of a purpose for the next century.
The collapse of the Soviet Union, I think I see it as the eye of the hurricane. It's the eye of the storm. Like, there was a bit of peace and tranquility right afterward, but we went right back into it with September the 11th and everything that's come afterward. So postmodernism, again, is it's the reaction to modernism. So this idea that technology would triumph, that we could create utopia, well, it failed. And so modernism didn't last more than 3-4 decades. And then postmodernism came in and essentially became really strong in the 1950s and 60s, especially the 60s, and what we call the counterculture, the sexual revolution, all those things that came out. The hippies, yes. I mean, all of that is postmodernism. That's the beginning of postmodernism, and we are still feeling its effects here. So what happened was, in the despair of modernism's failure, in the despair of having technology and rationalism become the new God, and it didn't, it failed, postmodernism says, look, we don't live in an objective universe. You can't find objective truth. There is no God. We can't even reinvent God through technology. We can't even reinvent God through great government. No.
We can't properly impose order because order itself is a flawed concept. There is no order. There is no order to be discovered, so there's no point in trying to create one or hold anybody to it.
Yeah, there's nothing objective. The only thing that exists is the individual, and the individual is part of a group. And we'll kind of get into the group talk a little bit later, but essentially, as individuals, whatever we think is true. And this was kind of the age where you find cultural relativism and philosophical relativism, where really one person's idea is no better than another. One person's religion, one person's way of doing things is no better. Everything is the same. Everything. And this leaks into the New Age movement, and in my opinion, and this is what I kind of want to get into, it leaked into Freemasonry, where, the symbols of the craft, it's whatever you want them to be. They actually have no meaning. There is nothing on the other side of the symbol. However they talk to you, that's all that matters. And I actually think that was poison to Freemasonry.
Well, I mean, absolutely, because I think that what has to happen in order for the, let's say, the fulfillment of the postmodern idea, that idea is that it very quickly goes to kind of the essential question of whether or not there is morality, because like you said, there's cultural relativism and philosophical relativism, but those are really just two outgrowths of moral relativism. And because if there is no God, morality comes from God, or at least did at the beginning of postmodernism, if we have eradicated that, if we have eradicated its representatives on earth in terms of the monarchies and the classical systems of political authority, once those are swept away, so both the source of morality and its enforcers, and the attempts at instituting reason-based, rationality-based moralities in the early 20th century also failed, then the response of the postmodernists was, well, let's just give up on morality. Clearly that's just a can of worms that shouldn't be opened because it just results in all of these terrible things. So we should steer away from that and enter a world without morality, because clearly not only has it not done us any good, it's done us harm.
And philosophically, what you're saying, Brother Axel, the postmodernism is described as a couple of things. But first of all, as societal constructs. So they're like, morality is not an objective thing. God doesn't exist. It didn't come from God. It doesn't come from nature. The idea of morality was constructed at some point by people in society, in ancient civilizations, as a means of controlling people, of imposing hierarchies and power structures over people. And so the church, they usually use the church as an example, they constructed all this stuff that we've been taught and indoctrinated with as a means of control. So not only is morality an invention, but it is our sacred duty to realize that and take the reins of that power and create our own morality for ourselves. That nobody should be able to impose anything upon us.
It is, it makes sense because, Nietzsche's quote that we read earlier it puts in perspective his philosophy of the Superman, right? That in order to be worthy of this deed of killing God, we have to become as God, so that we can basically comfort ourselves in the fact that we've done this thing. And postmodernism is actually leads you into a similar kind of libertarian almost philosophy of individual realization, where you become the creator of the world because you have to be. Because you can't attach yourself to any external creator, because, like you said, that's viewed as an ancient attempt to brainwash you. So you then have to create your own universe and become your own God. They actually fall in line with Nietzsche's philosophies of the
They
Superman.
do, but he didn't believe, he wouldn't have been a postmodernist.
No, Nietzsche's
least in my
Superman,
opinion.
Nietzsche's Superman, as far as I understand it, were to be people that had to realize that they had to take on such astronomical duties to the rest of humanity that they end up living almost completely altruistic lives in the service of other people, because they are the few strong people that basically realize they have to take care of everybody else.
Yeah, Nietzsche, I don't think he came up with this idea on his own. I mean, the Supermen that he talks about in his writings in the late 19th century are essentially like the masters of wisdom of theosophy. Mm-hmm. They're like the prophets of the Old and New Testament. I mean, it's this idea of certain individuals that have been endowed with such qualities that they can lead other men on the paths of virtue and understanding. So I think he just sort of rewrote it in a way that
was palatable to a rationalist German audience in the 19th century.
Exactly. But it's just something recant here. So morality comes, is a big part of postmodernism, and that's why today gender and sexual orientation are no longer binary choices, right? I mean, we've heard of being gender fluid and non-binary. People using more than the he/she pronouns, for example, and I'm certainly not putting any judgment one way or the other on the subject. Only that these type of discussions were not normal 100 years ago in society. Especially if you go back 150 years ago to Victorian England. None of this would be on the table for discussion, but it is today. And I think a lot of that's thanks to postmodernism. That a lot of very rigid forms have been broken down, allowing people to express themselves. But also, everything has been put in the hands of the individual in terms of their own self-determination.
So I think there's a very central postmodern concept that that explains what you're saying here, and that's the idea that in postmodernism that they've identified what they call grand narratives. These society-wide stories that we tell ourselves in order to orient ourselves in reality. And I would think that traditional gender roles, for example, are an example of a grand narrative. It's this story that men and women are different, they have different talents, different capacities, and they need to perform different roles in society. And then there are various sub-narratives within that, various mythologies that explain, what it means to be a good man in a society, what it means to be a good woman in a society. And these myths and narratives kind of come together to form a grand narrative of gender roles.
And I think a lot of people can agree with that, but the grand narratives are also things like the Renaissance, the Enlightenment. Like historical periods are considered grand narratives, and they are to be rejected by the postmodernists because all grand narratives have been fabricated by somebody, are not true, and they're only there to put in your head ideas that will control you. So other grand narratives are like Nazi Germany's, the superiority of the Aryan race. Like that's a grand narrative. Marx's fight of the proletariat against the bourgeoisie is a grand narrative. Jesus Christ is a grand narrative. They're like grand stories, and anytime you hear a grand story, Santa Claus is a grand narrative. These are all fabrications to the postmodernists, and they have been written by individuals for the purpose of control.
So to give the postmodernists some credit at this point, most of the early postmodern philosophers were either French or German intellectuals who would have been born just before or during World War I and lived through World War II. So they had seen what they had perceived as basically the violent collapse of grand narratives. Because, we're all very familiar with the Nazi grand narrative during World War II of the supposed supremacy of the Aryan race and that they were going to conquer the world. But I think less is talked about that those same ideas were present in World War I. The idea that, the German Empire was going to sweep through Europe.
Nationalism.
All of the nationalist myths that fueled all sides of both of those wars were very much at the forefront of the actual living memory of the people that came up with these ideas, and they had seen not only their societies fall apart, their friends and their parents die, an unimaginable slaughter had taken place in their homeland, and they basically associated that with the rise of these nationalistic stories, of these grand narratives of progress, and the idea that if only we get rid of all the people that are in our way, this great and glorious future is awaiting us. And now they're living on the other side of that, and that hasn't emerged. So they are naturally pessimistic towards those ideas. And I think in our modern age, it's easy to look at that and be like, well, why would you destroy all these things? Well, we're not living through the immediate aftermath of what those grand narratives can do.
Well, and it's not limited to politics and to religion. They even view science as a grand narrative. And they're very suspicious of what science dictates. Now, that being said, when you look at today, the typical postmodernist today won't necessarily reject all grand narratives. I don't think that's even possible. We all need some grand narratives, right, to operate our life on. Mm-hmm. And I even think the postmodernists usually betray themselves and pick up some grand narratives. So, for example, social justice today, many postmodernists are postmodernists, or in all truth, postmodernism sort of influenced and created the social justice movement. But that movement in itself is a grand narrative, a belief
freeing the oppressed from the oppressors.
Equality, equity, those type of things. These are grand narratives. The pure postmodernists, and I don't know how many purists there are out there, would have to have rejected, but that's not the outcome of all these events. But grand narratives, in general, are supposed to be destroyed, and what you are doing is creating your own narrative. So, each person is the author of their own life, and that's the only thing that you should be doing is creating your own life. And that goes back to the idea of choosing your gender regardless of how you were biologically born, because you should dictate what you are, not society.
Well, because and how often has everybody who's listening to this podcast heard the words, well, that's my truth, or speak your truth, or I'm going to speak my truth. There's this idea that individual subjectivity has been elevated to co-equal with objectivity, or even surpassing.
It's not even equal.
Exactly.
Objectivity doesn't even exist.
Yes. So all that we're left with is my truth and your truth, and the intersection of those truths. Right.
I think another point to make about narratives too is that we have to, as individuals, not only author our own lives, but it leads to the idea of deconstruction. This is the main tool, the main weapon in the arsenal of the postmodernists. Is how do we get rid of grand narratives? How do we get rid of these moral ideas of the church? How do we get rid of all this rationalism? How do we deconstruct this idea that because you're born a certain way, with certain biological features, that you're automatically a boy or a girl? Like, they're like, no, these are all grand narratives of science, religion, and politics, and we got to deconstruct them. And deconstruction is a very specific idea. I mean, by hearing the word, you kind of can infer what it means, but there's a very specific philosophical sort of imperative that comes with it.
Well, and we've mentioned it a few times, but I think it bears repeating that, like, one of the ideas of postmodernism is actually that at some point in the past, constructionism took place. That groups of powerful people that wanted to assert dominance or control over other groups of people constructed grand narratives in order to justify their positions of power over everybody else. And to be fair to the postmodernists, that has some degree of truth to it. That certainly has happened in human history.
It's absolutely happened.
That absolutely has happened in from place to place. But the idea in postmodernism is that, okay, so we've got these ancient periods of constructionism. What we need now is a period of deconstructionism, where we go through these grand narratives and basically identify all of their constructed pieces that were used to oppress or wield power over somebody, and take those apart, show them to be unjustified or absurd or in need of redress, and it leads into, like you were saying, how the movement of social justice came out of postmodernism. Well, the natural response to that is that, okay, we've identified all these grievances, now we have to propose and advocate for policy that redresses them in some way socially. We have to make our deconstructions an actual reality.
Deconstruction, the idea was developed by Jacques Derrida, a French philosopher in the middle of the 20th century. And the idea of deconstruction is that you have to identify anything with what they call, quote unquote, a binary opposition, right? So the idea of a binary opposition is as simple as boy and girl, black and white people, tall people, short people, happy people, unhappy people. Anytime that you're in a conversation and someone's trying to tell you that there are two different sides to something, the deconstructionist philosophy say, okay, right there's a grand narrative. They're trying to tell you that there are two sides. And they say anytime that two sides are presented, a binary choice, one will always have to be better than the other. So, men are better than women. Historically, they're saying, with the power of the patriarchy. White people have been over black people. Tall people have an advantage over shorter people. Skinnier people are prettier than fat people, and et cetera, et cetera. So all the examples I just stated are what the postmodernists say. Identify that, hear them. And when you hear them in a conversation, or you read them in a book, or you see it in the news, that is what you need to deconstruct. And so what you do is you need to eliminate this opposition. So that's why in terms of gender politics today, they're like, no, there's no such thing as male or female. You can be whatever you want. You can pick a third or fourth or fifth option. There isn't a binary choice. You must destroy all binaries, right? And this was the first step of deconstruction. Identify binaries and remove them.
Mm-hmm. No, I was just thinking while you were talking there, that this should be of particular interest to Freemasons, right? Freemasonry is, in some sense, a science of duality. That's one of the I would say, major themes of the Masonic mythology is this idea of duality in the universe and how to understand its interplay and our relationship to it. And in Masonry, it's not by making everything the same. And another thought I had while you're saying, so I've wondered for a long time, and perhaps we'll get into this later as well, there's this trend in popular culture and media towards showing everything as bad, right? That by taking old stories and basically making every side of the old story equally terrible, that you've somehow destroyed this binary. Good guys and bad guys is another binary opposition. We find that most often in media and art, particularly storytelling, and that's where a lot of the postmodern influence on society today is in storytelling. And there seems to be this idea that to tell a true story, a good story, you actually have to show how everybody in it is equally bad, and that they're all kind of these conniving, power-hungry people that are just manipulating one another and trying to get power, because that's really all that human beings do. You see a lot less media and stories these days of people that are good and virtuous and don't have this kind of like flawed, dark, gritty side that makes them, quote unquote, real.
I mean, I think a great example of this is the Game of Thrones series, right? Anybody that's listening who have heard it, you'll know what we're talking about immediately. Like, there are no good guys, right? Everybody's done something bad. Nobody's perfect. And there's really no heroes. And even the people that we start to consider heroes, they end up doing something that we don't like, right? So Game of Thrones is very much a postmodern story where, all the archetypes of the Middle Ages, the hero and the princess and the prince and the good king, they're all reversed, right? Ned Stark, you think he's the noble, Lord of the North in season 1, and you don't think there's any way that his head's going to be cut off, right? But he just gets cut off, and that's it, and everything just gets worse and worse and worse. So there's no vindication for his character. And, bringing it to modern times, it's, the 1950s, right? The 1950s by some was considered this great age, right? But most films today, Mad Men, those type of things, they want to show you all the negative things that came out of the 1950s. Not that it's not true, but they're doing it on purpose to deconstruct our concept of the 1950s. We're deconstructing the idea of the princess and the prince and the king and the hero and all of that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think that is essential to the idea of what they might call balancing out these binaries is again, because the binaries aren't just binaries to the postmodernists. They like you said, they represent an inherent power imbalance, right? Because to the postmodernists, everything in society is just power and the distribution of power. And the work of postmodernism is essentially to show that these power imbalances exist, and we should undo them for the sake of undoing them, because any power imbalance is an injustice and an oppression.
I don't disagree with deconstruction. I think it's a great tool. I mean, I think we have to go through life and identify these binaries that we have in our life, these assumed, good and bad, up and down binaries, and we should deconstruct them. I think it becomes dangerous when we take it to a societal perspective, because society needs structures, it needs hierarchies. Freemasonry, for example, it's very hierarchical. It has power structures. There are binaries, and they're necessary for the instructions of the initiate, right? And if we were to remove all of that, Masonry would cease to be. So I think the assumption that all power hierarchies and that all power distribution is bad is as equally as silly as too much power in the hands of a few bad people, these evil oligarchies, so to say. But we need hierarchy. I mean, you need people in charge. You need people that are skilled and proficient to be in charge of those that are learning still to do so, right? Well, so it's a great internal tool. It's great for spiritual development, this deconstruction. But is it great to just deconstruct every element of society until there's nothing left?
Well, and the point of deconstruction, at least, in my opinion, is the act of destruction is useful insofar as it clears ground for something to be built. You know, if I look, you know, both of us have worked in construction at one point or another in our lives, and like if we just went around demolishing every structure, well, that's not going to leave us with a functioning society. I mean, nobody has anywhere to live, right? The idea of demolition is that you're clearing away the old to build up the new. And the building up, and this is where, you know, to go back to your hypothetical pure postmodernist that I'm not sure actually exists, the pure postmodernist is actually a destructionist, not a deconstructionist, because eventually, like, there can be no reconstruction, because reconstruction in their eyes requires some kind of a grand narrative. You have to tell, like how would you build something on an eternal truth in a world where you don't believe in eternal truths?
Well, I think individually, on an individual basis, you can use deconstruction and deconstruct yourself. On a societal sort of point of view, you can't, because that leads to the second point of deconstruction, which is once you've identified the binaries, Jacques Derrida says, well, here's the second problem and solution, which is once you've destroyed one set of binaries, there will always be an inversion of binaries. And what he means is like, okay, so you have the French Revolution, and the poor people, they beheaded the king and queen, and they took over. Well, now all they did was some of them became the new aristocrats, right?
Yeah.
And there's a new poor and a new rich. And so then you have this idea that another revolution will occur at some point when everybody's identified, oh, those are the rich people, they're bad, we need to reduce them down to us, or we need to go up to their level. But in either case, we don't want this binary of rich and poor, right? Well, every time you cut the head off, you know, the rich or the powerful or whatever oppressor you're trying to get to, you're just going to replace it with a new system. And I think Jacques Derrida is actually quite brilliant in recognizing this, but I think he's absolutely true. Like, these power structures will naturally reoccur, even if you've eliminated them. So he calls for essentially like this idea of permanent revolution. And I think he took this from Karl Marx's, you know, Communist Manifesto. But the idea is like, okay, we identified binaries, we get rid of them. But the only way to prevent new ones to arise is to have permanent deconstruction. Mm-hmm. It's just to keep this, you know, deconstructing constantly. We have to constantly be alert and be vigilant in finding these new binaries that have arisen. So this goes to your point here, Brother Axel, that like, how do you construct a society? How do you construct anything if you're permanently destroying?
Well, and that too is kind of, you know, one thing I would say about using deconstruction on yourself too. I mean, like you said, and growing up as a staunch conspiracy theorist, you know, I've been a practitioner of deconstruction for a long time. But there comes a point where, like, you know, you're kind of, you know, striking blind in the void in a sense. And this, like, I think even within oneself, a permanent state of deconstruction is not ideal. No. Really, a permanent state of anything in a human being is probably not ideal. We are meant to change and to adapt and to grow and evolve, and that means not doing the same thing forever. So I think that anything carried out to its extreme is going to be detrimental, but especially, you know, if we... what's a good example? So, I mean, how many people do you know that have, you know, continually read self-help books but don't seem to get any better?
Too many.
That's in a sense, that's kind of like positive deconstruction. You know, I know people that are constantly trying to analyze and understand their personality, but their personality doesn't actually change because they're constantly trying to understand it. And they'll move from one test to another test to really, you know, trying to hone in on these details and figure out what they, you know, what they're made of. But there's no next step towards what they can do about it. And I think that is the kind of dangerous allure of deconstruction, because everything can be deconstructed. Nothing's safe from deconstruction. Like, if you and I don't want to be too strong on the postmodernists here. When I say nothing's safe from deconstruction, I mean that it is a very powerful tool that can always be applied. Like, if there is a structure, it can be deconstructed, because it's made of something. Like, you've put some things together to make a point, therefore it can be taken down. And that's the problem with deconstruction, is it's kind of like an invincible weapon. It can destroy anything.
Well, yeah, I mean, listen to media today. I mean, movies or social media. Like, everyone's just criticizing everyone else and deconstructing the hell out of our civilization. Oh, the founding fathers were bad. Oh, our government structures are elements of white supremacy. Everything's systemic racism. Not that these aren't true to some degree, but they also aren't the entirety of all these structures. And to just try to deconstruct our entire civilization, well, what do you replace it with? Because whatever you replace it with will also have to be deconstructed. So you're basically, you're clearing the foundations for the building of the Holy Temple, but you're never allowed to build the Holy Temple.
Because it's not holy enough.
Because it's not holy. And it's like, well, you have to build it. And if it's not holy, it will be destroyed. But you still have to have a period of construction. And it kind of goes back to what I said at the beginning of the podcast, that this is like, this is good for when you're a teenager. This is what teenagers do, right? Everything is lame. Everything sucks. Their parents are stupid, et cetera, et cetera.
Society's lying to them, and the man just wants to keep them
exactly.
down.
And 9/11 is an inside job, right? And so, eventually you kind of grow up and you're like, okay, my parents actually weren't stupid and not everything's lame and some of the stuff was actually pretty neat and maybe I was a little ignorant. I didn't know what I was talking about. And, you don't necessarily, you're not what you were raised with, but you take some of it and you replace it with some new ideas. And so I think it's a necessary stage, but you got to grow up at some point. So I think postmodernism is like, okay, we had this classical world for thousands of years, and postmodernism is us sort of getting, from here to there. It's that teenage phase, and we need to go through it. But if we live in postmodernism for the next 1,000 years, we're basically just being teenagers.
We're just
for the next
human
1,000
teenagers.
Years.
Yeah. And
no.
we know from example that that's not a stage of human development that one wants to be stuck in.
Nah, you want to go through that as quickly as possible. You got to do it, but do it as quickly as possible. And I think this goes back to Freemasonry in that the requirement for the belief in a supreme power. Why do we believe in this objective authority? Well, because it roots us in something. It establishes a foundation of truth. It says that these symbols do mean something in particular and that we just need to discover them. But they're not whatever we want them to be. They're not whatever we need them to be. They are something that are true and that we just need to penetrate their mystery to get to the truth. And so in this idea of classical theism, this idea that there is a supreme power, it gives us something to hold on to. And I think that everybody needs something to hold on to. Whether God exists or not is not even the question at hand. It's the idea that we need to have the highest authority, something that grounds everything else in some sort of objective reality that allows us to create a civilization where we can have a common basis, a social contract.
Well, otherwise, without that, everything's absurd. And I think that's why you see absurdism and postmodernism developing right alongside each other, is because when you do take away that axiom of truth that you described, everything does become absurd. So if I look at, and Masons listening to this will understand what I'm saying, when you look at the rituals of Freemasonry and what we do in a lodge, without the reality of that professed belief in the supreme power and all of the things that come off of that axiom, what we do is absurd. If you are this kind of secularized postmodernist that doesn't believe in any of that and that thinks that we've brainwashed ourselves into believing in grand narratives, well then dressing up and going into lodge and doing what we do does make no sense and is a comical, absurd thing to do in a foolish attempt to avert thinking about our own death or something like that.
You just made me think of a great postmodern reference in popular culture, Monty Python. The Monty Python and the Holy Grail, the Life of Brian. These are deconstructions of narratives that they mock, right? And they mock everything in their movies and shows, and they even mock Freemasons. There's a bunch of skits that Monty Python does where they're mocking Freemasons with their funny handshakes and their aprons and all that. Anybody that's seen them, they know exactly what I'm talking about, and they're making it absurd. They're deconstructing it, because that's what Monty Python does. That's why everything is a deconstruction these days. There's very little media that is constructive. It's all just. I don't want to be vulgar. It's just crapping on everything.
Yeah, no, and I think that's, and when we get to the next idea that you and I wanted to talk about, I think you see why. that door has opened up is because of this postmodern idea of the death of the author, which is basically the idea that once an author of any creative work, whether it's a book, a piece of music, a painting, or a film, or whatever, the author of that work, as soon as that creation is finished, the author is no longer relevant to explaining the work. It's all about the interpretation of those that view the piece of art. So if somebody writes a book, it's what the reader thinks about the book that's important, not the author. And one of the greatest examples of this in the modern age is Lord of the Rings, and really anything written by Tolkien. Because Tolkien wrote a bunch of letters after he wrote The Lord of the Rings to all of the fans of the book, explaining what he meant by everything and why certain characters were a certain way, or what certain ideas were, or what certain characters represented what ideas to him. And a lot of that has been dismissed because, what he thinks is irrelevant because, he was a Catholic fundamentalist that was just, trying to push his religious worldview on everybody. So what he thinks about his own writing is irrelevant now. It's all about what we have interpreted since.
Another example of that is Harry Potter. So J.K. Rowling's, for example, there's some controversies of things she said about transgender people and supposed homosexual characters that it was never blatantly said in the books, but she said afterward are. And especially after some of the supposed transgender comments that were supposedly not in favor of transgenderism, a lot of fans were like, well, it doesn't matter what she thinks. These are my stories now. And they killed off the author, and they have assumed control of the story, so to say, right? Mm-hmm. And so, the death of the author it was kind of introduced as an idea in 1967 by Roland Barthes, another postmodernist. And Roland Barthes basically, wrote this essay, which was called The Death of the Author. And he kind of outlines all these ideas. And people really ran with it at that point. And that's why you see in media today a lot of, those childhood cherished franchises like, Star Wars and Star Trek being, they're being reintroduced, but completely in a different way that a lot of the fans don't like. Why? Well, that's the author.
Because it doesn't matter what
George Lucas? Who cares what George Lucas has to say? Gene Roddenberry for Star Trek. It doesn't matter. We're going to create the way we see Star Trek and the way we see Star Wars. And you know what? In fact, we're going to deconstruct. We're going to deconstruct Luke Skywalker. We're going to deconstruct Starfleet and the Federation. We're going to show that they're not really heroes, And that's the movie The Last Jedi. I mean, they show Luke to be sort of weak and pathetic because they were deconstructing the patriarchy. They're deconstructing the idea of the hero. And so this idea of the death of the author I think it's actually a little insidious, to be honest with you, because not that the author has complete control over how I view the story, but I think it's important to try to determine the intent of the author, right? I mean, in Freemasonry, isn't that what we're trying to do? We're trying to figure out where Masonry came from, who wrote it, for what purpose. That's the purpose of the mysteries, to penetrate the mystery. But if we don't care who authored the mysteries, then how can we get to the goal of the mysteries if there is no mystery?
I think understanding the intent of the author is one of the most crucial things you can do with any piece of media that you enjoy or find to be profound or meaningful. I mean, if you look at Tolkien as an example, only because I brought him up earlier, but he has this entire worldview behind his stories because he was in the trenches of World War I. He saw these horrors that were unleashed on Europe after the death of God and the abandonment of traditional mythologies. And his intent was to create a new mythology, a synthesis of all these old legends that could knit people back together again so that such an unimaginably destructive event wouldn't happen again. That was his intent. And when you understand that about Tolkien and what Lord of the Rings is meant to represent, then it takes on a more serious kind of character to the stories, and you can understand why everything was the way it was. And I think, if you find something to be valuable, I don't understand why you wouldn't do that. Like why you wouldn't want to understand where that thing that you cherish so much came from.
Well, real quick, because I almost, this is really humorous. You had read an article, and I'm trying to remember the specifics. Maybe you can remind me. Some postmodern author had written about Lord of the Rings, how like the orcs were the oppressed and the elves were evil.
So recently I read an article. I wish I could give credit to the author, but the author's dead, so I don't remember him. No, it was an article that was basically saying that Tolkien's ideas in Lord of the Rings were outdated and damaging to a modern progressive society because they entrench all of these kind of archaic, patriarchal, traditional values, and that the orcs are naturally representative of the oppressed victims of colonialism, and that Sauron is actually the face of modern progressive science. Which, funnily enough, it's actually true. Like, Sauron is the face of, cutthroat industrial scientism that Tolkien thought was destroying traditional ways of life. So the author, whether meaning to or not, actually did get that completely correct. But I don't think that the orcs are meant to represent the oppressed people of the world.
The death of the author goes back to this idea of God again, because they'll use the term the author God. That, prior to postmodernism, that the author was always viewed as the God of the text that had been written. So what do you do with God? You got to kill God, because, God and man is another binary opposition. You have God is better than us and man is subservient to God, and therefore we must destroy the idea of God, right? So this goes back into deconstruction. This goes back to Nietzsche's question of, God. Once you remove that objective source, which the author has always been considered the objective source of the text that's written, but you destroy the author, you destroy God, you destroy objectivity, and now you can do whatever you want with the text.
All right, Brother Matthias, tell me what you think of this, because what you just said there gave me an idea that I find, I think I understand now why the death of the author is so insidious, is because it destroys the mysteries. Because if you kill the author, so what we were just talking about, so you've got the author of a piece of work, right? And there's the exoteric work, which is the story itself. But the author's intent and the author's understanding of the story is the secret interpretation of that story. It's the meaning behind the story. It gives context, it gives depth, it gives understanding to the purpose of the story. So if you're killing the author, you're also destroying any chance of understanding the mysteries behind any given story. Because if we look at the stories in Freemasonry are not meant to just be read as bedtime stories. We're meant to penetrate beyond them to the truth, like you said. But if there is no author behind them, there's nobody we can consult as to the true meaning of these stories. There is no reason to look beyond the story because the author is dead. There is no real secret. There's no real truth to be found.
Yeah, I mean, and that's why modern life is about amusement. So everything is just a point of ridicule. You ridicule everything. You deconstruct it. You just make fun of it. Because that's essentially how they deconstruct today. It's like they create a million memes and destroy the idea until it's just so ridiculous everyone's laughing at the idea. The problem is what is left over after you've laughed at everything.
Oh, nothing. You end up just laughing in an empty world.
Yeah.
Right?
Everything's a joke. Everything's absurd, like we were talking about earlier. And that's what happens when you kill the author. Now, granted, I think there's some validity in this. Like if I read Lord of the Rings or watch Lord of the Rings, and it answers a few questions of a dilemma that's going on in my personal life at the moment of watching that film, and I'm like, oh man, it was really inspirational because it helped me overcome. Let me think of something like alcoholism, whatever. Was that the intent of the author? No, it wasn't. But so we can take subjective truths that impact our personal life from text, but I don't think that should negate or take away from the intent of the author. I think both can coexist without mutually destroying one another.
So I think too, there's another aspect of this idea that I'm thinking about now is that what comes along with the constant mocking of narrative and specifically the characters in those narratives is that in olden days the characters of a story are heroic figures, and heroic figures exist to give us models of behavior. These are why we have heroic figures in religion. They're supposed to show us the perfect way of human life, like how we're supposed to behave in the face of a chaotic reality that nobody really understands. We're given these supermen, to use Nietzsche's term, that we're supposed to emulate. But another thing that goes along with this kind of death of the author and the absurdism is like, there's this idea now in culture that to emulate anybody is inherently a bad thing. Like, a priori, to emulate somebody, to copy somebody else's mode of being, means that you're being controlled or oppressed.
You're
or
following
brainwashed.
a grand narrative.
Following in general is now, it's a bad thing. Like if somebody is acting like somebody else or acting like a character from a TV show or a film, they are kind of seen as like having a weaker or lesser mind because they're not able to do it for themselves, which is the holy grail of the postmodernists, is that you're supposed to reinvent yourself on your own. But not many people, and I would say not any people, are really capable of doing that, and we need role models. But role models are now just another trick of oppression and systems of oppression and injustice to control us. And I think that is also a very damaging idea for people, especially when we look at it from a Masonic context, because in Masonry we have heroes, and those heroes are there to instruct us in the proper mode of finding the truth of the mysteries.
No, absolutely. I think that in the end, the problem here is that these tools, which were meant for internal investigation, for self-effacing thought and internal discovery, it's, deconstruction is vitriol. Vitriol is acid essentially. Mm-hmm. And when applied to yourself, you can burn away all the excess, dogmas and doctrines that really aren't a part of you, but that have been imposed and you've been brainwashed with. So vitriol is deconstruction, right? Mm-hmm. And it's a critical element of the mysteries. But the problem is, if I apply it to myself, it's one way. But if I apply it to others, then I'm just destroying other people.
Yeah.
So deconstruction has to be something that is for an individual to do unto themselves and only unto themselves. The moment you apply deconstruction to other people, you're just a destroyer.
Well, and you're entering into a realm that there's no way for you to have a proper understanding of. Like, you cannot properly understand another person to the extent that you could deconstruct them. I would say it's actually quite an offensive thing to do to another human being, to assert that you have the right to deconstruct who they are based on the fourth hand removed impression of them that you get.
It's an act of superiority. It's literally what Jacques Derrida says is, it's a binary opposition. I'm smarter than you and I'm better than you and I know what's better than, what's better for you, you're right? Mm-hmm. So how dare you deconstruct another person?
Yeah, it's actually it's quite a psychic crime, actually, in my view, too. The myriad of internal emotions and experiences that another person not only has had, but will never have the ability to communicate to you, I think just should preclude that automatically from you ever considering that should be your right.
And that leads us essentially into, the consequence of death of the author is history is fiction. History as an instrument of oppression. And many of you may be familiar with the ideas of, like a lot of authors investigating, Benjamin Franklin and George Washington and the founding fathers and saying, well, these were actually slave owners. They were not good people. Christopher Columbus, actually murdered a lot of Native Americans. And so the ideas that we grew up on in the 20th century of seeing these individuals as heroes is actually false. And so they believe, since history is essentially written by authors, that all of human history, as recorded, is a fiction. Because anything that anybody writes is always a fiction. There's no such thing as objective truth. Therefore, there is no objective history. And all written history is just from the point of view of the author. It's subjective. And it's used typically as an instrument by which to say, well, these characters in history are good and these characters are bad. And that's where you get this this famous quote, that the victors write history.
History's written by the victors.
That's a postmodern quote right there. The assumption that only the victorious get to write and that the history and it's not necessarily true actually in history.
Well, no, and it has the same effect as what we were just talking about. Where you are basically erasing the majority of a society or a historical character's humanity by attempting to do so, by generalizing human beings in such vast swaths, like to paint with a brush so broad as to be absurd. I mean, not only do you do an injustice to the actual people that lived through those periods of history and performed these things that you have now judged to be the incorrect historical action, you actually do yourself an injustice in the sense that you'll never understand history that way. You can't. By applying modern morality to people that lived 500 years ago, you're making it impossible for yourself to understand what happened. You never will, because you're talking about people who lived in a way and did things in a way and for reasons that you are just completely shutting out of your mind as having ever been, not even just valid, but have ever even been like people look back, and this is something that I kind of realized in studying Christianity, is that we look back at history, and particularly from the postmodernist perspective, and I myself was guilty of this as not guilty, but like wrapped up in this as a conspiracy theorist, is like you look back at history and you just see this kind of parade of people.
It's a web of intrigue.
Not even that they're all just trying to take power from each other, and that was the main motivating force of human history. But then you read about Constantine and the incident of the Milvian Bridge and what happened there, that he had this vision of a Christian cross in the sun, and that he believed that was going to restore the Roman Empire. Like, people acted for reasons that were beyond what we can comprehend, because we have so thoroughly killed God that we can't remember how much of a factor that was.
Well, it's not even remember. We can't even conceive how people would believe in such quote unquote stupid ideas. Mm-hmm. Really, people would act, in accordance to a belief in God. Like we think that either
that they would just say
they're
that
disingenuous.
After the fact. Yeah, exactly.
Constantine's lying to us. He's trying to control us.
Yeah.
They're using Christianity to reinvent the Roman Empire. So there's always these sort of like explanations in order to justify our current thoughts.
Well, what it makes me think of too is you should tell the idea of Leonard Peikoff and the Greek mathematicians that that the objectivists were so happy about the math but discounted all of the other beliefs.
Oh yeah, I was listening to Leonard Peikoff's. He has a bunch of There's YouTube videos of a bunch of university speeches he gave on the pre-Socratic philosophers, and actually he ends up going through all the way through into modern times, but he's basically trying to vindicate Ayn Rand's objectivist philosophy, and he goes through all these pre-Socratic philosophers like Pythagoras and Heraclitus, etc., and anything that goes along with Ayn Rand's grand narrative, should I say, he's like, these people were so smart, and even back then, without all this science and math, they were able to figure this out. But if they believed in anything mystical or spiritual or religious, that was just silly and nonsense, and we should just disregard it. It's like, well, can you really take an individual like Pythagoras and be like, well, he was a great mathematician and scientist, but all his mystical ideas were stupid? Well, it was his mysticism that was informing his science and math.
It's the same as that death of the author thing.
Yeah.
It's like, what, are you going to kill Pythagoras? I mean, maybe we should examine where these ideas actually come from. And by cutting out such a huge segment of the human experience, I mean, you'll destroy the idea of history, which I think, as we'll see, it may not be far off from what the actual goal is.
I really want to talk about history as oppression and fiction in the scope of Freemasonry, because I think actually I don't even think most Masons have realized this, but if you look at the 20th century, what you see is a complete deconstruction of Masonic history. So the idea that Masonry came from the mysteries, deconstructed. Masonry came from anything religious or from King Solomon's temple, deconstructed. The only possible explanation that's reasonable is that it came from the operative guilds. Masonry is a club. Masonry doesn't have the keys to saving the soul. Masonry is not a religion. All these phrases. I mean, some of them come maybe from the 19th century, but it's really the 20th century that sort of cements this idea that Masonry has no antiquity. All the authors like Mackey, Albert Mackey, and Albert Pike, and Dr. Oliver, and all these other great writers who I think were just absolutely brilliant. Wilhelmhurst and Newton. They're all wrong. We've deconstructed it.
Yeah, we figured
that's all fiction.
We found all the pieces of paper, and it says no earlier than 1717.
And that's why, deconstruction doesn't just come, with these people that, want to destroy everything. It has infiltrated our academia to the point that, everything from the past is false. And we have to take a look at everything again and again, and we shouldn't recreate any sort of sauce because there's no way we'll ever know, and it's all nonsense.
Yeah, and that's again that we're getting into a world that is unmoored from itself. We're basically in the middle of a bridge and we're cutting off both sides. We can't go back and we can't go forward because going forward we're going to oppress somebody, and if we go back, then that was just a parade of oppression. So we don't want to go back in that direction. So then we're just stuck in the middle of this thing, hacking on both sides of it, waiting to fall to our deaths.
And this is where postmodernism creates an uneasy alliance with rationality. Though it rejects the grand narrative of rationality and the grand narrative of science, it will use those when it's necessary. And it's not a contradiction to postmodernism, because it believing only in subjectivity, it can subjectively use what it wants when it wants. And that's the beauty of it. That's the ease of it. Whatever suits you to use it, and when you don't want to, discard it. There doesn't have to be a moral consistency or a rational consistency. So we could say that that's kind of nonsensical, but from their point of view, it's very consistent with the idea of subjectivity.
So on the topic of subjectivity, there's another very important idea to the postmodernist. It is definitely a later addition to the philosophy, but this idea of intersectionality. I'm sure everybody has heard of that term at some point. It's very popular
in the last several years
in the modern era. But the idea of intersectionality is essentially this idea that a person is not just a person's not a grand narrative. It ties into this idea that we were talking about earlier. You're not the story that you tell yourself. A person is the intersections of all of the various parts of a person. So, for example, your race, your sexuality, your gender identity, your affluence or poverty in a society, your social standing, your career, your level of education, your religion, etc., etc. All of these factors of your personality intersect in you. You are just an intersection for all of these things. And they kind of view it in the sense of there's these are kind of lineage, cultural, racial, and religious lineages that kind of have been passed down through the ages, through your parents and grandparents and et cetera, your genetic lines to create you. And that society's larger movements have kind of intersected, and that you stand at the nexus of all of these many intersecting lines of history, of family, of philosophy, and that out of that you emerge. But that your component parts, you're not a pure individual.
You're not an object.
You're not an object. You're a subject. That's exactly right.
And your subject depends on all these different masks that you put on.
Yes.
I am a Latino, male, Catholic, Mason, business owner, et cetera, et cetera.
Well, and when when your intersections are identified, it becomes much easier to change them for other threads, essentially, to bring other things into your intersection. And that's why, and to some extent, I think this has been a good thing in the last 20 or so years, that this idea has entered into the culture that what you are is actually a much more fluid kind of state of being, and less a thing to be moved.
The person that kind of coined this term her name is Kimberly Crenshaw, and she's alive today, and she kind of created this idea back in the 1980s out of postmodernism, even though she has some criticism of postmodernism, actually. But she divides it. She's a black woman, and she divides it because she's like, the problem is that, we can say white men have the most power on earth. That would be the, what she started as a premise. But the problem with black women is that they're both a woman and black. So white women would have certain advantages in the power hierarchy where there's, the patriarchy rules, the white patriarchy, because, well, they might be women and quote unquote are inferior to men, but they're white. And black men, they might be black, which makes them inferior, between quotes, but they're men. So they have something in common with the white man, right? But a black woman has neither in common, and therefore they are at a more disadvantage than the white woman or the black man. And so then, the problem is that you can keep, this is a pyramid that goes downward forever, where you can keep breaking these apart to find the most oppressed people.
I think that really speaks to the idea that the postmodernists have, which is that like power hierarchies to them are ingrained in every aspect of society, and the work of postmodernism then is to kind of to figure out and then naturally dismantle whatever instances of power hierarchies they can locate around them.
I think this is an extremely useful structure. I mean, I know a lot of people mock this today, and of course, I think it can become silly depending on how many levels of intersectionality you want to affirm. I mean, you can literally just add hundreds of these intersectionalities. But when we look at race, religion, social class, these big ideas that have been circulating in history as the points of conflict, I think intersectionality does identify these power structures. And I think it's true that certain groups are more in power than other groups, and that helps us identify these power structures and to maybe distribute the power in more of a fair way. But I think this only leads to more social turmoil because, then, it's basically it's protests, it's legislation one way or the other. And everybody falls into two camps here. There's the dichotomy of the left and the right, and intersectionality aggravates one side, and for the other side, it becomes sort of gospel truth, right? And I think Masonry has the better approach on how to solve the problems that are identified by intersectionality, which is the creation of a universal brotherhood. And I'm going to specifically point out Co-Masonry here as being better at this than Mailcraft Masonry, because if you have a society that accepts both men and women, people that are of all racial backgrounds, religions, sexual orientations, etc., and within this society of particularly the Co-Masons, what I'm referencing here, everybody has to dress exactly the same way. Everybody's referred to as a brother. There's no sisters and brothers. There's no different pronouns. There's only one pronoun. There's he for everybody. I think this sort of unitary view is what we're looking for to erase these problems. Yes, you can identify them using postmodernism, but if we're going to construct a society that we don't have all these woes and dangers, I think Co-Masonry has kind of created a model for that. Like, let's bring everyone together. Let's actually get rid of all the labels, and let's just have one label for everyone. And then in doing so, that's really equality, right? That's really fraternity. That's really liberty. All these distinctions among men have been eliminated to the point that we are just all human beings. And beyond that, I don't know what else you can really do.
Well, you took the word right out of my brain, because as you were speaking, I was thinking like it's a constructive approach as opposed to a deconstructive approach, and to me, the only productive response to the truths uncovered by the deconstructionists, because, like you said, I'm not going to completely deny the fact that deconstructionism has its uses as an intellectual tool and should be applied from time to time. But to me, in my mind, and I think in the way that the Masonic rituals teach us to look at reality, we then have to construct. We are members of a building craft. Like for us,
yeah, exactly.
For us, continuous deconstruction doesn't make any sense because of the things that we've chosen to believe and the things that we've set out as our axiomatic truths. And so, in order to give a proper solution to this problem that results in something being constructed, I think you have to take that approach where you say, okay, well, granted, these terms may have meant different things at different times, and maybe they're not applicable to everybody in their worldly life, but when you cross the threshold of the lodge, you are a brother, you will be referred to as he, you will wear the same clothes as everybody else. You will be treated the same way as everybody else according to your rank, your merit, and ability, the degrees to which you have attained. And underneath all of that will lie this foundational equality on which we will build. But I think it's the building part that is the difference here.
And if I could kind of narrow down on that idea, I think as an apprentice and as a fellow craft, deconstruction are your main tools. So the apprentice is learning the trade of masonry, and the fellow craft is beginning to implement it. But it's the master mason that's the builder, right? But before you can be a builder, you have to deconstruct yourself. You have to get rid of those superfluous knobs and excrescences. You have to make the rough ashlar into a perfect ashlar, and I think deconstruction is the main tool. And I think this has always been known in the mysteries. So when we look at the various traditions throughout the world of mystery religions, I think this was the main tool, right? Instead of maybe a 24-inch gauge, a mallet and a chisel, maybe it was a shovel and a pick. It's like these are digging tools, right? And this is how we get to that point of vitriol. That's how we go deep within the earth. We have to dig down. We have to discover who we are, and by man knowing himself, there's an element of deconstruction. But once you know yourself, at least to some partial degree, then I think it logically moves to the point of constructionalism. And that's where postmodernism, they've never gotten to that point, unfortunately. I think, they're so busy deconstructing, they're like, well, what do we put in its place? Well, Jacques Derrida, Roland Barthes, they don't have the answers to that. And I think that's the biggest setback with postmodernism.
I think you hit on something very important there when you talk about, the working tools of the first and second degree. I completely agree with you. I think they are absolutely instruments of deconstruction. The working tools of the first degree are essentially destructive tools that break apart things that have stood together for too long. The working tools of the second degree are essentially tools of sorting and measuring that allow you to determine what it is that you've broken apart. And how appropriate is it to describe the third degree as one of reconstruction? For those that hold the sublime degree, I would say there's nothing more appropriate than to think of the third degree as a reconstruction of the person.
It's a restoration.
Restoration, exactly.
So I think the mysteries have been practicing deconstruction in a productive way, in the right way, for thousands of years. And then postmodernism has taken those ideas and then made them essentially into a religion in some ways, because the idea of just constantly mocking everything and trying to deconstruct it has become sort of a pastime for the Western world. It's a religion now. Everyone does it, and almost every movie, every book, and all media is just deconstruction now, ad nauseum. And you know what? It's getting old.
It's getting nauseating. But I think the point that you made earlier in the episode about that this is an adolescent philosophy is that, well, luckily, like other adolescent philosophies, they tend to fade with age and experience and new information. And as humanity, I continue to believe in the evolution of humanity and the fact that we make progress despite the arguments of the postmodern. I think that eventually this is something that we're going to file away as useful for a time and for its own aims, but not the end of humanity. I don't think we've reached the pinnacle of human understanding now, and I don't think that continual and regressive deconstruction is the way that we get to that pinnacle. I think we have to continue building in an upwards fashion. Otherwise, we're never going to see, the real destiny of humanity made manifest.
So our next section here, Brother Axel, is power hierarchy. So we've been talking about power and its structure, but in the 1960s and 70s, there was another French philosopher. They tend to always be French, of course. His name is Michel Foucault, and he started to talk about these power structures. Specifically, he was talking about sex. So I think he has a book called, I don't remember the name now, but it's a book that literally tries to deconstruct biological sex and the way we view sex. And he kind of separated power into three different structures. He says first there's sovereign power, and this is the obvious power structures. It's the presidency. It's like
the powers
it's a king.
of the state. Yeah.
Yeah. It's you can identify them. Almost every human being can identify the power structure. It's the police. It's the army, right? And this is sovereign power. It's visible. It's not invisible. It's very clear who they are. Then the second level of these power structures is called disciplinary power. And this is the power that makes us yield to rules. So when you, for example, impose in a school standardized testing, that's disciplinary power because you're trying to get everybody to conform to certain ideals by imposing certain standards like tests, right? It's also societal expectations.
Would you put religious power in the second category, or does that kind of straddle the first and second? Is that
First and
between
second,
sovereign and disciplinary?
The papacy is a sovereign power. It's visible, but the instruction of Catholicism to young kids would be considered disciplinary power.
Or religious ethics in general are a disciplinary force rather than a necessarily sovereign force.
Exactly. And essentially all morality, imposed from a cultural level of expectations, and taboos is disciplinary power. The third one is biopower. Biopower is the masses. So this is peer pressure, essentially. You go to school and everybody's wearing like sweet Nikes and you got to go get Nikes. That's biopower. So like just the masses can get you to do something because you're getting swayed up in their power, right? Now, sovereign power obviously interacts with the two levels below them. Like they create the standards that are being, used in schools and in societal norms, and then they're of course manipulating biopower to get everybody else to do what they want, and then the structure moves upward as well because you can't really have disciplinary power or sovereign power without people, without the mass, without the
biopower to support it. So what does after identifying these power hierarchies, what's Foucault's, I guess not answer, but prescription to do about all of this?
Well, it's still an element of deconstruction. He's just specifically creating the visible structure for us to see where the different power structures and hierarchies are coming from. But he focused on sex. So he saw sex to be a pseudoscience. He's like, there's no such thing as male and female. There's no such thing as heterosexuals or homosexuals. There's just people, and people like pleasure, and that's just the way it is. And as a little interesting side note, Foucault also he was advocating within the French government in the 70s to get rid of the age of consent because he thought consent was another social norm. It's another disciplinary power imposed by society. So he thought minors could engage in sex just as much as adults, and that we should take that right away from them.
So when Foucault is talking about power, then is the solution to this to make those that are powerless powerful and those that are powerful powerless, or to remove power altogether from society?
The latter.
Then that, I think, is entirely anti-Masonic, in the sense that the Masonic Lodge requires of the lodge itself not only to generate a kind of power in the performance of its rituals, right? That the work of Masonry requires power and energy behind it. In order to do that, the lodge itself requires hierarchical power structures in order to channel the mystic power that's generated by the ritual.
Your brother, actually, when it comes to Foucault, you're not only you're right. I'm going to give a little quote here because the mystery schools essentially believe that the soul is imprisoned within the body, and that our desires and the pleasure that we seek is what's holding us down in matter and not allowing the soul to ascend back up to God, right? Well, Foucault, knowing this because he was a brilliant philosopher and had researched all this, he said that the opposite, that the body is the prison of the soul. So this ties into his sexology. And now that I remember, that's the name of his book. It's called Sexology. Is that this idea of the soul that religion has been promoting for 10,000 years is actually the mechanism imprisoning the body. So by saying, look, you can be any gender you want or have sex with whoever you want at any point in any way, is liberating the body from this idea of the soul.
From the tyranny of the soul.
Yeah.
Well, then that too, I would say, is anti-Masonic for the same reasons that you laid out, in the sense that Masonry is the great work of the soul to liberate itself from the prison house of the flesh. Now, if we're going to reverse those roles, well, then we're clearly not talking about Masonry or the ancient mysteries anymore. We're talking about its exact opposite.
Well, and we can see what's happened today in society, because I think the ideas of Foucault have been normalized in many ways, for good or for bad. That's for each person to determine. But essentially, the sex has been deconstructed in a way that it hasn't been in all of recorded history.
No, and again, no, I'm trying to play fair with the postmodernists here, in the sense that, like, if we look, for example, at I think you brought up Victorian England earlier, and that would be an example of a society that had swung so far to the extreme that the body was absolutely subjugated to the soul, and as a Mason and as somebody that believes that the soul is to be liberated from the body, I think that is generally the direction we should move in. But at the same time, I think a lot of the societal neuroses of the late 19th century were caused by this fixation on subjugating, concealing, and negating the body in such a way that people, I think, became unnerved by living in a society like that.
Well, and I think Victorian England, they were so oppressive that the result was rebellion.
Teenage rebellion, almost. In the same sense that we've described postmodernism as an adolescent philosophy, that kind of, if we look at, and we use Victorian England as an example because it's probably the most well-known, but really that was prevalent in Europe and America at the end of the 19th century. Those attitudes towards the body and sex in general were very kind of repressive, in the same way that you almost have to be repressive with a prepubescent child, in the sense, or a child on the edge of puberty, in the sense that, if you let this just go completely out of control, you're gonna do yourself some harm. And it's very interesting how humanity follows these cycles that we see repeated in childhood.
Yeah, I mean, complete repression to total freedom, back to repression. It's the pendulum just swinging back and forth. I mean, both extremes are not productive, right? Mm-hmm. Being in the center, as Masonry teaches, is the best way to go. Now, to Foucault's credit, I believe the deconstruction of sex does serve occult wisdom in many ways, because I think, and we've discussed this on other episodes before, but a human being is composed both of male and female forces, of feminine and masculine energy. And I think the degree of the mixture of the two just depends on the individual, partly probably based on nature, partly on nurture, but in any regard, we're all sort of different mixtures of these two elements. We're all part men and women within, right? Part man and woman. And I think it's useful to deconstruct sex, so for us to look at it in a more objective way, and then not just assume, what we have been taught for thousands of years. But I think it also can go to the extreme that, in identity politics, it can also become trendy. It can become fashionable. It can become something that brings attention to the self. And there are obviously individuals that do feel that way. And I think all that should be respected. The people that believe in the binary option is fine. And the people that believe that there, maybe an infinite number of different,
gender expressions.
Yeah, gender expressions. Like, that's fine too. I think we need to respect both sides of the aisle here. But the use here, again, we see it in Masonry, because when we enter the lodge, we are a he. At least in Co-Masonry, we're a he. We're masculine. Well, and the lodge is feminine.
That's an important point to make in Masonry. In Masonry, you and I aren't necessarily you and I. We are united to form one body. Like, the lodge is composed of its members, but when we're in lodge, we're in the lodge. But it's not you and I, right? It's the officers of a lodge. It's the like we take on a
role.
Well, I was going to say a certain abnegation of our personality, in the sense that, like, who you and I are in our mundane, working life is not who we are in lodge. We are specifically called by the Right Worshipful Master to become one body. And that body is masculine because it's entering a feminine body in the lodge. And that interplay between those two occult genders, so to speak, I think is what creates the magic of Masonry.
I like that, occult gender. So, yeah, I mean, when we enter lodge, when we process into the lodge, it's like entering the womb, right? The womb of the mother. And there is a balance between the masculine and feminine forces that are found in the creation of universal brotherhood. So I think the occult sciences have understood this deconstruction of sex for a long time, but now it's becoming more of an outward expression in society, which I think the rebellion has been healthy. I just hope it doesn't swing so far that it creates truly a societal identity crisis.
Yeah, I think that is I think we're kind of seeing that in the sense that in all areas, it's trendy to say that, that gender is the main concern of our time. But I think we see this kind of instability in every aspect of our society, whether it's in areas where we're starting to realize that systems that have been in place for a long time are not serving the purpose that they once did, that in fact they may be doing harm to people that was either intended or unintended, and it's time to redress those, or just in general that the state of human life as it is on planet Earth right now nobody seems to be happy with it, and yet we're all doing it. We're kind of in the middle ground between realizing that there's a problem and doing something about the problem. But everybody kind of understands that, like, life is not perfect right now. It's in fact far from perfect for pretty much everybody. But we haven't quite gotten to the point where we're actually going to do something about it. And
we don't know what to do about it.
And that's the point.
Yeah.
Is like if we start lashing out blind, then I think we get ourselves in a lot of trouble. So, Brother Matthias, I think there's a final idea about postmodernism, or that's within postmodernism, that I wanted to talk about today, and that's the idea of the panopticon.
I love the panopticon.
I know you love the panopticon. So for those of our listeners that don't know what a panopticon is, and that's probably many because it's a very niche philosophical idea, but the panopticon was a creation of Jeremy Bentham. He's a 19th century philosopher. Came up with the concept of utilitarianism, which, if you don't know what utilitarianism is, you probably are a utilitarian, because it's one of the most popular social philosophies out there. It's basically the idea that whatever we should do it to maximize human pleasure and minimize human pain. The greatest good for the greatest amount of people. And so Jeremy Bentham came up with this. It was originally an idea for reforming Victorian prisons. But the panopticon is the idea of a circular prison. So it's under a dome, and all of the cells are arranged on the perimeter of the circle. And at the center of the circle, there's a singular watchtower. But within the watchtower, there's no way to see into it from the cells. So if you're in a cell, you know that there's a watchtower that can theoretically see all of the cells from the outside. But you never know if the guard in the watchtower is specifically looking at your cell or not.
Or even if there is a guard.
Or even if there is one. You've been told that there is one, but you don't know that there is one. So you get into the situation where at the center of your prison is the Eye of Sauron, and you don't know if he's looking at you or not, and you don't even know if he's real. But somebody at one point told you he was. And so the idea of Bentham was that this would serve to reform Victorian prisons by making people behave better because they would feel under constant surveillance.
So Foucault took this idea from the 19th century and he used it to explain the power hierarchies that are preventing the liberation of mankind, these binary oppositions. He says that biopower are the people in the cells, right? And the disciplinary power is the watchtower that you don't know if it's looking at you or not, so you have to conform to certain rules and standards. And that the whole prison was built by the sovereign power. So to kind of go back to his power structures. So these three are all encapsulated within the panopticon. And that essentially this is how Western democratic / capitalist societies have maintained control over the people. We are actually, it's not that somebody's actually watching us. It's that we think people are watching us. Okay? And who do we think is watching us? Oh, it's God. God is watching us. We shouldn't sin because we might go to hell. That's an example of the panopticon. But then it moves into state apparatuses where we think that maybe the state's watching us. And this becomes pretty real today with the surveillance state. The government may be listening to your phone calls, reading your emails, looking at your social media.
You know that they can, but you're not sure if they are.
But because you assume that it's a possibility,
you alter your behavior.
You alter your behavior because there's the idea that in private, when no one's watching, you'll act one way, but in public, you'll act another way. So essentially, our modern civilization has used the panopticon allegorically in order to create all its systems of control over us. And what we need to realize, this is what Foucault says, we need to realize that there's no guard men in the guard tower, and that we can just walk out of our cell and leave. That we're really not being watched. That it's all a fabrication of the state, it's a fabrication of religion, and we need to leave. Now, what's interesting, Masonically speaking, is that I think the idea of the panopticon is definitely within Freemasonry in the symbol of the all-seeing eye, right? Mm-hmm. The all-seeing eye of providence is always watching over us to record our deeds, whether they are good deeds or ill deeds. And so we find the same idea of this all-seeing eye within Masonry, and I actually think it's a pivotal part of humanity, the idea that you're being watched. And I know this sounds kind of weird and anti-liberty, but I think it's important that we have some concept of, responsibility to external forces.
Well, if you think that's weird, let me get weirder then. So I think the panopticon is an absolutely accurate, I wouldn't agree with Foucault necessarily, but I think it's an accurate description of the reality that we find ourselves in. The only difference for me is that in my interpretation of what I've learned from Freemasonry would tell me that there are people watching, but there's two faction of watchers. There's one faction of watchers it's rooting for us to get out of the prison, and there's another faction of watchers that wants to keep us in our cells. I believe that there are forces of light and dark in the universe, and that one wants to keep us in the prison of the flesh, and one wants to see our soul liberated from that prison. So I think the panopticon is absolutely real. I think we're in it right now, but I think that the reality of the guardsmen is undisputed, and they're on two different sides.
No, I tend to agree with you, Brother Axel. I think taking the position of the mystery schools that that the earth, the physical universe, is the prison house of the flesh, then the all-seeing eye of providence is watching, and it's what allows our soul to ascend up the Jacob's ladder towards Mount Olympus, towards the heavens, to reunite with God. So our actions are being watched and recorded, and we need to mark well in order to get up there, right?
Well, I think and so here's where I will attack the postmodernists in a sense. I think that the idea that we're not being watched on Earth is very convenient for people that don't want to be watched on Earth, because I think what some of the postmodernists don't like is that the idea that there are eternal consequences to our actions, whether or not we're witnessed. Right, by saying that there is no watcher, you're basically, it goes back to this idea of there is no morality because there's nobody to record your actions and judge them. And I think I don't want to go all the way to the opposite extreme of saying, if you have nothing to hide, then why are you worried about people watching? Because I don't think that's exactly the point of the panopticon. I don't think we're being spurred to good behavior by the threat of punishment. I understand why there's an uneasiness to that. But I'm also uneasy with the idea that there's no consequences for behaving immorally.
Well, there's no immorality for postmoderns. But let me ask you a question. I want you to consider all the stupid things you've ever done in your life. Okay? I'm considering mine as we speak, and you give me your answer after I give you mine. Just about everything that I've done that I've completely regretted was either I was not being watched by the people I respected, so I did some stupid things, and then I regretted it. It was stuff that I would never have done had my parents been watching, had I been in public. I was always in secret with people that were, probably not the best people to hang out with, right? And I did stupid things. And those are the things, like, if I knew I was being watched more, I may not have done it. Now, my only problem with this is that, again, we shouldn't do things just because we feel like there's a consequence. But then I'm like, well, but without consequences, can there be civilization?
Okay,
but answer my question.
There's two questions there that I want to answer. So the first part, I completely agree with you. I don't think any of the stupid things I've ever done have been in the presence of somebody I respected. Otherwise, I wouldn't have done them. But I'll ask you a second question on the heels of that, in the sense that everything that was monumentally stupid that I ever did, I knew at the time was monumentally stupid, and that there was a small watcher inside of me that said, "Hey, you probably shouldn't be doing this," but I went ahead and did it anyway. And I think that impulse is what Foucault is trying to kill out in us.
Are you saying that there's an internal panopticon?
I think there is an internal panopticon, and I think that
like intuition.
Intuition. It's been called the holy guardian angel. It's been called, your inner voice, your Jiminy Cricket, so to speak. The angel that sits on your shoulder and tells you not to do stupid things.
Yeah.
That's a very easy watchman to get rid of, because it's within you and nobody else is repeating what he's saying, so you can shut him up for a little bit to indulge yourself.
Well, then I think Freemasonry is helping us to realize that, the outer panopticon is false. Foucault's partly right in his analysis. We shouldn't be feeling guilty because of church and state spying on us, but we should turn inward to the inner panopticon, the voice of God that is, moving us along the path of preferment. And again, as we're reaching here the end, I think we should give our final words on postmodernism. And, my issue with postmodernism is that it's so good and it's so right when you use it on yourself. But when you apply it to society in an attempt to change it into something that you want, I think it's insidious. I think it's antithetical to civilization.
Well, civilization is a construct. Civilization is something that we build. We've known this for millennia. It's something that's preserved. I mean, this idea is preserved in the mysteries. We're builders of civilization. That's what it is. And so I think while there are ideas within postmodernism that are very valuable to understanding one's own personality and even changing one's personality. I mean, really, like, if you really are burdened with a ton of dogmas from a religion that you absolutely disagree with, or you came from a family that believes some wacky stuff that doesn't have a place in the modern world, or that you don't believe it does anyway. I didn't have that experience, so I guess I don't really I don't understand that drive to get rid of ideas that were planted in me. I never really got that from my family. So, but I think there's a lot of throwing the baby out with the bathwater in postmodernism, where there's this idea that because there are some problems with our society, we should just completely destroy it and start again. I mean, I think we have to be very, very careful in doing that. We've already tried to do that 100 years ago, and hundreds of millions of people died as a result. The 20th century is a result of the first attempt at reshaping society in our own image, thinking that we're the gods of our own natures and that we can create everything just out of whole cloth. I can't help but think that we can't do that. That is not open to us yet. I think it's possible that humanity could become like that, but I don't think we're there yet, and I think we play with very dangerous forces when we think that we are.
And Masonically speaking, we're always being taught to walk the line between two worlds, right? We're treading the Mosaic pavement, and we need to embrace all the things that we encounter. I don't think it's good to reject postmodernism and in its entirety. I think it's here for a reason. It came out of an age. It
has something to teach us. Absolutely,
exactly. It is a lesson to learn. Is it the end? No, but I'm not sure. The Enlightenment wasn't the end, and the Greeks and Romans weren't the end, and the Christian Church wasn't the end. But I think they all add something.
Be either.
Yeah, but we should always try to take the good out, the useful out of each movement, every age, and apply it to the next age. And I think postmodernism is run its course. I think we've had enough time questioning everything and deconstructing it and making everything a joke and a meme. And I think it's time to start rebuilding civilization. Postmodernism is like the the equivalent of the deluge. It's washed over our society. It's all the old structures have been swept away in many ways, and I think that's good. I mean, there was a lot of inherent racism. There's a lot of inherent misogyny. There are a lot of problems with civilization that postmodernism has allowed us to see and confront. But it isn't going to fix the problems. What's going to fix the problems is the idea of being builders, of being masons, of constructing civilization, of getting us to the next level of prosperity and understanding and universal brotherhood. And if we can bring the lessons of postmodernism with us, I think we're all the better. And we're equipped to identify in the future very dogmatic and bad ideas, because we still need to deconstruct things that don't work. And we need to keep it as a working tool, but no more.
Thank you for listening to Legends of the Craft. This podcast is purely the opinion of brothers Matthias Comsier and Axel Suvari, and does not represent the official views of Universal Co-Masonry. Universal Co-Masonry is a Masonic order founded on the principles of liberty, equality, and fraternity that admits men and women without distinction of race, religion, or creed. For more information, please visit universalfreemasonry.org.